Assalamu alaikum. Today's presentation is going to be short. It's going to be on despair, and you might say like positive despair and then negative despair. Because not all despair, by the way, is bad, and that's based on the Quran. I'm going to walk you just through 3 verses in the Quran, and in particular, what I want to focus on is brainwashing, gaslighting, and healing from brainwashing. And I mentioned this if you've been monitoring my talks on this. This particular one is focused on despair related to brainwashing from both directions. One where, again, you're facing toxic guilt, and you reach that point of despair. The other is where that was your reality, but as I mentioned, in between freedom versus escapism, where God comes to your aid and you've healed yourself. And how does that look like? When now you might see despair goes from you, you're able to push it and bring it to the oppressor. And then the third one is where you're being gaslighted, and to the point where you're struggling with the impact of the gaslighting, but how you won't absorb, you're not absorbing that despair, but you're turning to God with that despair. Now, if I can walk you through, I'm in chapter 12. This is the chapter on Yusef, chapter Yusef. You should see it right here. And I have the Arabic. Just want to show you how I do it. The root letters is right here. So if you could see the letters, yeah. Hamza and then Sin. So you see, yes. So if you look at it, I'm just looking in particular for this chapter. You hover over it, you could see the English part. First one I'm going to look at is I should probably start with the other one. Hold on a second. Let me start it from this one right here. Oh, not that one, this one. Yep, that one. This is verse 110, chapter 12. Looking at it on the receiving end. Brainwashing. You're telling the truth. You're being accused of lying. You're being accused of lying. And then after a certain time, this leads you to the point of, if you can read the English, respite will be granted until when the messengers give up hope of their people. Sort of like us, yes, you're feeling that despair, and I mentioned this because when I was reading through the feeds about Sudan, one of the women said something very kind of relates to this, where she's like, what image, what words do I need to use? What do I need to say? You're thinking if I share this or if I share that, it's going to wake up people's conscience. So similar to that sometimes people, when they're going through this crisis and they're facing a brainwashing, where the impact is then you're being treated as liars. And Palestinians obviously went through that. We went through having to prove that this was a land with a people that was stolen by another people who were never on this land. They were European white settlers that came to the land and stole the land from the people. So we spent decades trying to prove, about that whole lie of a land without a people for a people without a land. It took us decades having to prove that that is false, having to constantly put out information out there that's evidence of all of these lies that they have been spreading about Palestinians are false. And, you reach that point where you're treated as liars when you're trying to defend the Palestinian cause. I mean, we're seeing it now, 75 years, it's starting just now bubble up. Still, the mainstream media is struggling. But, on social media, we're able to get the information out there, and the youth are open to look at it. But this is, again, what it feels like for the Palestinian community for the past, like, close to a century, where you're trying to defend your cause, defend the fact that this is stolen land. We are the victims, and our oppressors are acting like the victims on the world stage. So this is kind of the feeling of despair, those feelings of despair that most oppressed people struggle with when they are treated as liars. And the people that are brainwashing the community and also brainwashing them, treating them, because you're not just telling others, but you're also telling the victims, that you're animals, you're acting like you're literally talking to the victims. It's your fault, you're animals, you brought this upon yourself. Those are the words that they use. You're terrorists, you're monsters, even though they are the victims in this oppression and persecution that is taking place. But one thing I'd like you to note, I mentioned in the book, first one, God intervenes between a person and their hearts. Here, the despair, because God knows what's in your heart. And he knows the whole story. So if it reached that point, as long as you're connected to God and he reads your heart and he knows what's in your heart, that you recognize there is despair. God recognizes there it's reaching a point of despair. Notice that they're pushed, and then our help, there reaches them our help. Now God intervenes between a person and their heart. So he knows what your heart is going through. He knows, he's closer to you than your jugular vein. So if you are honest and you're telling the truth and you're fighting, and you reach that point of despair, turn to God, because God knows what's in your heart, and the help is going to come to you. And slowly, again, it's going to start, like I said, healing is kind of like the natural world. It starts to sprout and spread, and strengthen itself as well. Now I'm going to show you the part of where it's strengthened. So now Joseph, remember, he went through this also process. Why is the over not working? Hold on a second. Okay. Joseph, upon him peace, also went through this brainwashing process from his brothers. And I talked about it in independence and spiritually alive. So the help, when it comes, it doesn't sometimes look the way that you think it looks. Sometimes God creates that separation, and he also empowers you. He strengthens you. So that this time when you're meeting the oppressor, or when you're facing the oppressor, the despair now, as much as they try to, play the games, as much as they try to accuse, throw the accusations, and, I'm not going to go over through the whole story, but I have done a video on Al-Wali. If you look at it on my YouTube channel, talks about the story of Joseph. But here I'm talking about brainwashing and despair. Now we're looking at it from the side of being healed. So they tried, and they said, there was a brother, he also used to steal. So they're going again with that lying, brainwashing, playing the games that they used to play from before. And now he's responding with, again, that growth. This is the way the help comes, is it comes within first before it comes out. within, you can see that mental strength that Joseph has, emotional strength that Joseph has, spiritual strength, to the point that they lost hope. So what's in their hearts now? They lost hope. Stay asu. So now they are in the seat of despair. But notice it doesn't say in the verse that God comes, even though he reads in their heart that they reached a point of despair, but they reached a point of despair because they were lying. So there was no help that came to them, but they came to realization that, you know, all their games and manipulation and the lying that used to at first you were able to profit out of or work, or they got a result. Now they're facing the same victim. And now this victim is no longer a victim anymore. So God has now not just put him, you know, again, he was, and when they tried these games, he was again in that position of power. But it didn't work because they're used to playing these games. Even though they didn't recognize him, they're used to playing these games. And now, again, totally different. So when it says they didn't recognize him, it isn't just the fact that they didn't recognize the face, you know, or the physical, but even the very being has, again, that life that God gave him, you know, blossomed, and you might say the growth, the mental, the emotional, social, I said, you know, our human life compromises of many aspects of our being that are interconnected. So now they're seeing this very, you might say, emotionally, mentally, spiritually strong individual, such that they reached a point of despair. Because one of the things about manipulative people is they're kind of experts at lying. And so because they've always been able to successfully lie, but when you meet somebody of a strong faith, you know, strong, committed faith, then, you know, they face despair. Because those games and those lies and those manipulations, you know, they don't work on them. They can see right through them. And it just kind of like, you know, it stops right there. So that wisdom that God gave him on how to respond also in that particular situation, put them now in the seat of despair. So now they're holding a conference trying to figure out, okay, now those games that we've been playing before, they no longer work now. So this is positive despair. Not all despair is bad. It depends on what are you trying to achieve. You know, if you have hope in falsehood and you've been using all your skills, you know, it's like, again, power, what kind of power, how's it being used? If you're using it to manipulate, to oppress, it's essentially you reach to a point of despair. But notice how he put them in that state of despair. He didn't whack them, attack them, bomb them, knock them down. And remember, he's in power now. You know, he went from oppression, you know, from being oppressed, but now in a position of power. But you could see that mercy, as I said in the previous, escape accountability, you escape reality. He didn't escape reality. In fact, he was, you know, God was nurturing him all this time to a level of faith that now his oppressors are in a state of despair. God knows that they're in a state of despair, but he doesn't come to them with help. The third one that I'd like to look at, I'm trying to make it short. I will kind of combine them all in a later video, but this is about brainwashing and despair. Look at here. This one right here. This is, again, I mentioned this in another video, also on freedom and escape, regarding Prophet Jacob, who's being gaslighted by his sons, and they're lying to him. Remember, the liar, like, he doesn't just lie to the victim, Joseph, but he also lied to the third parties, because he needs them to kind of side with him. So here they're lying to their father all these years, just kind of like people are lying to Americans or lying to the world about what they're doing in Palestine. But he knows Joseph, and he knows the situation. He recognizes his instincts tell him something is fault in the story. The fact that the story keeps changing on their end. But here again, when, the feeling, he's reaching the point of, are they ever going to be open and honest about what happened to Joseph? Because there's still, one of the things that when someone knows you're lying and they're waiting for you to just be honest and direct and truthful, and you just keep wishy-washing and this kind of creates also a level of pain for the individual who's being gaslighted about what he's experiencing. So here, because he's a prophet of God, you could see he's reached the point also where he's going to be despairing, regarding what happened to Joseph. He knows they know the answer. He knows they know the full story, but they're not being honest about the truth regarding Joseph. And it can it's kind of like that issue of, somebody knows, but there's that lying of omission, and it's hurting Jacob. And so again, God intervenes between a person and his heart and directs Jacob to come to him. The point I wanted to, again, is about brainwashing, how it can impact level of despair on the victim. Despair, not just on the direct victim, but also the indirect, you might say, in this case, Jacob. And in that case, God will come, he will come to your help, come to your aid. But he will nurture the victim to such a state that when that oppressed is sorry, I'm thinking about something. When they are nurtured and they become again strengthened, then again that despair, of course, didn't you struggle with the despair, then that despair goes into, you reached a level of faith and strength, that despair now is in the being of those who are engaging in manipulation. Something to kind of note about just the concept of despair. Not all of it is positive, depending, again, what are you despairing about? And what's in your heart? That's something very important, because if you have despair, and you are telling the truth, God will nurture you. But you have despair, like here, but you are engaging in oppression and abuse, you will not be nurtured. So it's important to reflect on that. The other thing I want to take you to is, I had written something today about despair. And this is from the chapter, from the book, my book, Love is Deeper Than Words, the chapter Handling Uncertainty, Harnessing the Wind. Again, you could see how first it was, again, that seed sprouting, and now harnessing the wind, where now Joseph is in power, and they're coming, and now there's that wind coming, and he's able to now, with faith and with God and by God, be able to harness that wind and direct them to a more, you might say, better path. But it teaches you, again, if someone's going to say that they are favored by God and they were oppressed, you should see those signs in them. When you gain power, you should have went from Joseph in oppressed to Joseph in power. And I would use Prophet Muhammad, but because I'm speaking here with this video to people who don't probably recognize Prophet Muhammad as a prophet. So I'm trying to use a prophet that, or a figure that they might recognize and relate to. But there are stories in the prophet's journey that one can also find. I'm just using this one so that when you hear somebody, they were oppressed and they're in power, then you look at that and you see, are those signs there? Are you favored by God, chosen by God? Then we should see that sign from, struggling with despair to now you can see again, there was still mercy in his communication with his brothers. There was still compassion in his communication, but the despair, is now, they are in the seat of despair because their games, their manipulation, their lying, their brainwashing no longer work on him. And they came to that understanding that they have to change. None of these tactics, mental gymnastics that they used to do before, they don't work anymore. Lying, brainwashing, it doesn't work anymore. And so you see how when somebody is favored by God, chosen by God, how to see that. Now, of course, we're not all prophets, and we will struggle in ways and make mistakes that Prophet Joseph is not going to make, or Prophet Muhammad, upon him peace and blessings, are not going to make, because they are divinely protected from error. We will make errors because of our humanity, and we will struggle, but we look to that story to correct ourselves, the stories of the prophets to correct ourselves. And so, but we need them as a role model. We'll practice what they preach, word, action, spirit, in order for us to follow the commands of God. And then by looking at that, we can also recognize role models around us. And we're seeing that in Palestine, where people are, through persecution, how they deal with that persecution, God identifies them to us so that we can, look at them and learn from them lessons of how to deal with trials and tribulations. But I like this poem because it kind of summed up what I have just discussed. I put in brackets my own kind of comment. Acceptance. The poem is by Safi al-Din al-Hali, and is an Arab poet. First, you have to start with acceptance. Turn away from your worries and entrust your affairs to the decree. You can see that in the story of Joseph and all the story of the prophets. Hope, rejoice at the good which will soon be. You will then forget what has gone by. Of course, all these years that he's being oppressed, and then you couldn't see, that possibility, but to have that hope. Alhamdulillah, perhaps an issue which upsets you holds at its end what will gladden you. To recognize that there is a good reason why God is doing what he's doing. Trust, perhaps the tight road will constrict more so, and perhaps the universe will expand even more. And we saw that in his journey. Prophet Joseph, he went from trial to trial to trial. So it constricted, but he continued to trust. Surrender, indeed, Allah does what he wishes, so never be one who opposes him. And we saw that again in how he's being nurtured, all of these. You saw that in the story, that nurturing that's taking place. And then La ilaha illallah, Allah is your beautiful source of strength. So determine things by what has elapsed, excuse me. So again, they say that despair is an unforgivable sin because the despairing judged God in a way that denies his attributes of being most merciful, most compassionate, most generous, most loving, and that he's the creator and sustainer of the world. In short, despair comes about by how we judge the Creator and interpret the event. We can be open and turn to God with Alhamdulillah, all praise and thanks are only for Allah in all circumstances, and not place conditions and limits on God. So I just wanted to mention that. The other thing I wanted to bring to your attention is, as you're going through these sometimes lessons and you're writing them down, one of the things that you also learn is that for everything, when you part with it, there is a substitute. And you saw that again in the journey of Prophet Joseph. Like every time he went from one thing, there was a substitute. There was a substitute for that. But for God, if you part with him, there is no substitute. When in need, seek Allah, for after him, you'll need nothing else. So I don't like to kind of patronize people who are going through difficult situations that I am not experiencing firsthand or even witnessing firsthand. I'm witnessing it through a screen. I'm not even like there, like the journalists are taking those pictures, and I see their pain in their faces as they're doing that and they're sharing the news. It can break a person down. For us, as we're looking and we're seeing it on the screen at any moment, we can turn our screens off and go like rest on the couch. Our home is warm and cozy. We could eat, but as they are experiencing this, they're being displaced in this place, in this place, and hearing bombing upon bombing upon bombing. So I don't mean to in any way patronize or belittle or discount anyone's trial or tribulation, but just to give some, you might say, helpful reflections, if they are helpful. If not, to just ignore them, but something to look at that can help us understand how to struggle with despair and how to struggle with brainwashing that leads to despair. So I thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.